Hello, everyone. Jai Jinendra. We are back here again. I am Pragya Jain from the International School for Jain Studies, and I welcome you all today for a very interesting topic called Jainism and the Composite Messy Human Mind. And to deliver the talk on this topic, we have Dr. Tillo Detige with us, and to session to chair this talk today, we have Dr. Manish Mehta with us. To start the session formally, I would request Mr. Harshit Mishra to come ahead and recite Mangalacharan. Harshit.
Thank you, ma'am. Everyone, please join the hand. Then I recite the Mangalacharana. Namo Arihantanam Namo Siddhanam Namo Ayiriyanam Namo Uvajjayanam Namo Loe Sab Sahunam Eso Panchanamo Karo Sab Pavapanasanno Mangalanam Chasavesim Padhamam Havai Mangalam Padhamam Havai Mangalam. धन्यवाद.
Thank you, Harshit. Thank you so much. To welcome you all and to introduce our speaker and chairperson today, I would request Dr. Srinetri Pandey, our director, to come ahead. Dr. Pandey.
Namaskar, Jai Jinendra. I am pleased to welcome you all to the 22nd online lecture hosted by the International School for Jain Studies. Today's lecture explores the thought-provoking topic, Jainism and the composite messy human mind. You know, the complexity of human mind has long been a subject of exploration across various disciplines. A physicist may approach it through the lens of physical sciences, while a biologist might see it as a matter of biological process. For a psychologist, it is a central theme in understanding human behavior, and philosophers have debated its intricacies for centuries. And Jainism too offers profound insights into this multifaceted topic, contributing its own unique perspective to the ongoing discourses. We all are aware in Jainism, the ultimate goal is liberation, the release from karmic bondage that ties the soul to the cycle of rebirth. Attaining this liberation, requires purification of the mind through practices such as meditation, self-reflection, non-violence, and Jainism is known for its ethical conduct. So the human mind, according to Jain philosophy, is a complex and multifaceted entity shaped by the interaction between the soul and the physical body, with the mind serving as a bridge between the two. So in this session, we will explore the nature of the mind through the lens of Jainism, gaining deeper insight into its role in spiritual transformation. We are honored to have Dr. Tillo Detige, the Alka Siddharth Dalal postdoctoral fellow in Jainism at the Department of Religion, Rutgers University, with us today as chief speaker, or you can say to lead this session. Dr. Ditige's primary research focuses on the Digambar Jain ascetic lineage of early modern Western and Central India. He has contributed extensively to the field, publishing numerous journal articles and book chapters, including contributions to Brill's Encyclopedia of Jainism. Last year, he earned his PhD from a prestigious university in Germany, where he also taught Sanskrit and Hindi. Dr. Ditis, on behalf of myself and on behalf of International School for Jain Studies, I extend a warm welcome to you for this virtual session. It is our privilege to have our own Dr. Manish Mehta ji from Greater Detroit, Michigan, USA, as the chairperson of this session. Dr. Mehta has been actively involved with various Jaina, the Federation of Jain Associations in North America, so the various Jaina committees, and has served as a Jaina director since 2004. After a distinguished 25-year career in research and technology management, he founded Yamtech International LLC, an engineering consulting firm specializing in sustainable manufacturing for the transportation and defense sectors. He currently chairs the Jain Diaspora Committee, serves as vice chair of the Jaina Academic Liaison Committee, and is a member of the long range planning and interfaith committees, among many others. In 2019, Dr. Mehta had uh, Dr. Mehta made history as the first Jain Shravak, as the first Jain householder leader to deliver and explain the Nokar month invocation prayers in the Michigan state capital. Dr. Mehtaji, on behalf of all of us, I warmly welcome you as chairperson of this session. We have our co-founder, Dr. Sulekh Jain. We have our advisor member, Dr. Narendra Parsanji, Professor Prakash Chand Jain. We are honored to welcome Professor John Eckart. We have Dr. Natalia, Mr. Ifan, Dr. Brian Donaldson, Dr. Kuhn, uh, Abhaji from Delhi, Dr. Anil Mundra, Dr. Ruth, Dr. Ashok Jetawat ji, and I extend to Samri ji. I welcome my and once again, I welcome you all to the 22nd and
Thank you, Dr. Pandey. I think there are some network issues at your side. Oh, all right. So we are all ready to listen to Dr. Tillo and to know the Jain response to the composite messy human mind. So Dr. Tillo, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Jai Jinendra, Sadar, Jai Jinendra, Sabko. Good evening in India. Good morning for those of us in the US still here. I will have a presentation. I don't know if I am ready to start sharing already. I'll try that first then. Hmm. Pragyaji, maybe you confirm to me when this is working. Hmm. Mhm.
Have you started sharing?
Yeah, I'm trying to get the settings, but so I understand it's not yet working on your side, right?
No.
Hmm. Just give me 1 second. Mhm. Okay, I think I'm now ready to actually start sharing. What are you seeing now, Pragyaji?
I can see your screen.
This is
Uh,
full screen
yes, this is full screen.
and slides are moving, right?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, we're talking about technology. And as I logged into this session, I was thinking again how wonderful it is that we are able to do these online sessions, being across the world. Maybe by now it's a standard thing, but somehow I was marveling at it again. So the technology is there. So congratulations to the International School of Jain Studies for this lecture series, 22nd edition, I heard. Congratulations and thank you very much, everyone. Um, Pandeyji, Pragyaji, um, and everyone else for inviting me. Um, I understood I had like 14 minutes for presentation. I'm not sure if I will need that much because all in all, it's a relatively simple argument that I'm presenting. Um, But I just want to locate it within my broader research in the sense that when the very kind, generous invitation came from the ISJS, my first idea was what do I present? I received kindly carte blanche to present whatever I wanted. So the first idea was to present a summary of my ongoing and relatively long-standing research on the Gambara history in Western India. But somehow I felt I'm still working on it. The idea is that my recent dissertation would make a considerable transformation into a readable book. Um, but somehow I felt, well, this is something that I've done a number of times, summarizing my findings, actually both in speaking and in writing. So I thought maybe I can come up with something else. And then something came to mind that I've started brooding over while teaching. So I used to teach languages. This year I've been teaching Introduction to Jainism at Rutgers University, and it's been a very enriching experience in the sense, so this is a little bit the backstory, but in the sense that doing research, we focus on these very specific, detailed aspects, and then I found it very useful for me to now have to offer like a broader overview of different aspects of Jainism. And so then one thing that came up to me repeatedly throughout the course is these seeming paradoxes that I encountered in Jain practice, in Jain individual or collective practices, beliefs. And I started thinking about that. And um, so in that sense, it's like a relatively new little project. I don't know where it will go. And there's actually a lot behind it. There's like research in cognitive sciences, in the philosophy, no doubt, like a whole library that I could be reading and try and starting to explore to connect to this argumentation or this questioning that I have here. But I haven't done that, so I'm starting it in a rather intuitive way, but by like coming across a number of cases of what looks like paradoxes within the Jain tradition, um, and how I analyze that. So in that sense, I'm also very uncertain whether I'll be able to deliver on everything that Pandeyji and that Pragyaji were mentioning that could be done under such a header, under such a title. Um, but I have some food for thought. And one thing that I'm really doing here is it's not Jaina studies in the sense of I limit myself to studying aspects of Jainism, but I really use my findings, my observation about these specific aspects of Jainism as a case study to think about what I called here the human mind. So in that sense, my observations related directly to Jainism, or here I'm more extrapolating them to see what that actually tells us about what it means to be human, how we function as humans cognitively, really. And again, without all the necessary disciplinary expertise, perhaps, but the observations are there, so to speak. So to make it more concrete, um, Did we just move to the same slides without the titles, Pragyaji? Yeah, okay. So I have a number of cases here. I have four examples of what looks like paradoxes. And one thing that I definitely also wanted to say again before getting into it, and a point that will become clear towards the second half, is that when I talk about paradoxes and seeming contradictions, incongruities within the Jain tradition, what I'm doing is definitely not criticizing Jainism in any way, nor am I trying to look for a solution for these seeming paradoxes by siding with one side or the other or by making a compromise. I'm rather taking it for granted that both individual Jains and Jains as a collective society, as well as my extrapolation, any other human individual or human society, a social organization, social grouping, probably always, that's basically my hypothesis or my argument, that probably always we work within multiple epistemes, and during our daily life we shift between different models of self and world. So in that sense, people might take argument with some of the cases that I bring forth from Jainism, and that's everybody's good right, and these different opinions are exactly what forms my observations also. But just so that it be understood that I'm not necessarily trying to solve the riddles, nor saying that the one side is right, the other side is wrong, but that I'm taking them for granted. They seem to be there. Some Jains think about things in such a way, whereas in another practice they seem to be doing something else, etc. Now, the one that I'm starting with is a relatively well-known seeming contradiction, and Anne Vallely, in a recent publication in the Brill's Encyclopedia of Jainism, in her piece on Jain Bhakti, I think it's called, um, mentions that this paradox is actually something that has riddled Jaina studies more than Jains themselves necessarily, she calls it. We're talking about the absence of the jina and the presence of the jina. So I actually think maybe I start with a little quotation I have here from a well-known quotation or a well-known piece by Alan Babb, who perhaps in the field of Western Jaina studies was the first to theorize this idea of the absence of the jina, the fact that the liberated jina or a siddha, I'm using the siddha image, which, I mean, that image is actually more meant to indicate their non-materiality, but I'm using it here in a slightly different way to as a symbol for the absence of the jina in the puja rite, in the ritual act. So doctrinally, we know, and doctrinally, presumably most Jains know, that the jina or any siddha is what is called here transactionally non-existence. They are not responding. We are not praying to them for them to do something on our behalf. We know that that much is the word ashatna. That much would be a doctrinal error, because the jina is locked, so to speak, in his eternal bliss and his eternal liberation, is beyond any desire or any capability even to act. So in that sense, when we practice ritual, practice bhakti, we are, Bab and other authors ever since have argued, we are focusing on the virtues of the jina. The jina is an exemplary. We're trying to develop these virtues ourselves. When we give in puja, we're not actually giving to the jina because he won't be receiving, but we're giving up is another argument that Bab forwarded there. You have the concept of anumodana. We're praising the jina, and through that praise, we're actually getting karmic benefits ourselves. So this is an analysis of Jain practice, which is doctrinally sound, you would say, because it leaves it from the doctrinal stance that the jina is liberated and is not responsive, is not acting. Yet when we actually look at Jain practices, and I wish I would have had some of these beautiful Hindi bhajans here, perhaps, but all I have now is some English translations of possibly rather famous hymns, one to Parshvanad, one to Mahavir, where we see these requests, these petitionings, Vinati, Vinaya, Arach, and very often also, that might not be here yet, that element of viraha, that very widely disseminated literary trope of viraha, of longing for the jina, that in many other famous compositions would also be added. But here, at least, the devotee, the bhakt, is inviting the jina to come to the temple. He is begging the jina to do something. He's asking the jina to take these flowers, to reside in the heart, which will fill us with ecstasy. We are asking for support. So here, obviously, there's a certain presence and a certain capacity to act on behalf of the jina that is somehow taken for granted. At least that's the literary voice seems to take it for granted. So you're starting to see this first paradox that doctrinally we know the jina is absent, but in our devotional and here also ritual practice, we also seem to take it for granted, or at least our words literally say that apparently the jina can be directly addressed, can come to help us. And in these Digambara Stapana verses here that precede every puja, we have these three aspects. I think it's not just me, but it's commonly referred to as Stapana in general, but it actually consists of three parts. Ahvanana, where we actually call the object of veneration to us. In this case, a very famous Deva Shastra Guru Puja. So Dev meaning the Jina. So we're actually calling the Jina and the scripture and the Guru to us. Stapana, we're establishing them in front of our mind in a, most people would probably readily say, in a very imaginary way, so that the object of meditation, the object of practice, is mentally established for us. This part perhaps doesn't necessarily have that understanding that they can literally descend, but at least there's like a mental imagination that we are calling, establishing, and then that third element of sannidhi, the closeness of the absent jina. Perhaps the devotional example is a better one, where you really literally see that in our poetic language, in our poetic understanding of the world, in the register that we are in here, the register of practice, there's definitely a certain presence, a possibility of presence of that otherwise doctrinally absent jina, which is taken for granted. So that's a first paradox. And again, I think both cases, the absence and the presence are so widely disseminated that I don't think we need to question the correctness of the one and the other. They're both there very much. They're very centrally present in Jain thinking, in Jain practice. So it's perhaps a very good case to argue that what we need to do here is not to solve the riddle, to solve the paradox, or to think that there is any problem with the paradox. That's basically also my stance. But just accept the fact that that seeming ambiguity, seeming inconsistency is there, and see what it actually tells us about ourselves, whether we're Jains or not, what it tells us about our cognitive world, so to speak. I'll proceed to a second one. Um, with since 50 years, Jain yoga and tantric practices having seen like a renaissance or something, let's say, we are perhaps, and different meditation traditions, we're perhaps familiar by now by Jain usages of the chakras or the dhyan kendras. And then you have these, what are they? Three bodies and five koshas, these five sheets. So that as a Jain model, perhaps probably with variations, a Jain model of different understandings of our um, somatic, physical, mental being, what a human is made of. So that's one model of self or model of individual, which Jains might imbibe, might believe in, if I use that shorthand, but in much of what I'm doing here is I'm actually trying to replace that word of belief and of doctrine, but by actually studying what actually happens in our minds and in our bodies, how do we come to ascribe to certain worldviews or certain models of self. Now, when we have this yogic, let's say, Jain yogic model of the individual, at the same time, Jains also mm, use allopathy, or they have scientific anatomical models of the body also. They have perhaps a psychological understanding of the human psyche, which is derived more from Western practices or disciplines of psychology. So a second possible paradox or a second case where Jain individuals might be ascribing to different models of self at other times of their lives in different situations is this one, models of self and of mind and body. As a third one, I think I had models of the world. Perhaps again a more famous case, and perhaps for individual Jains, which is one which might be most problematic. At least we'll see, pardon, from some reactions that it seems to be something that calls for resolution, for resolving or something. Obviously, what we're looking at, you understood me, is the Jain traditional cosmology, the structure of the human world, the structure of the universe, of the loka. We know these models, we know these illustrations, the concentric islands, the, what is it, two suns, two moons, the layers of heaven and hell, the form of the universe, all these things. I mean, it's a well-known feature of Jainism. One thing that when I teach Jainism, students often want to write their papers on this. So they're very um, intrigued by it. But of course, it seems very difficult to align with scientific understandings of the structure of the world and the universe. Jains have come up with answers. A very famous one here in Hastinapur, the center of Arika Gyan Mati Mataji, where this attempt to resolve the paradox and to argue in favor of the correctness of the Jain cosmology has actually led to a new forms of architecture, these walkable models. I know there's other cases too, and actually these models are, so to speak, just they're a very manifest and very extensive expression, but behind it is also a research institute which can't think of the name exactly. I think it probably with Bugol Sanstan, Jane Bugol Sanstan, something like that, where the attempt is really to show that the seeming incongruity between Jain cosmology and scientific cosmology is merely a consequence of perhaps our limited understanding, but both are actually compatible, both are partial, or at least the scientific model is just a partial understanding, but ultimately there's no conflict, there's only a limitation in the scientific model. So this is a solution, and in a way you could say symbolically perhaps that these huge manifest buildings do express in a way that some Jains really struggle with that seeming incompatibility of the traditional cosmology and then that scientific worldview, which is really so dominant worldwide. And then this as a solution, the argument either being that, well, either in other cases, sometimes the argument could be that one is wrong, the other is right, or in this case, perhaps rather that they're compatible. They're not actually mutually exclusive, mutually contradictory. And I mean, here then we're talking about cosmology, but more general too in many other fields of science. You have the same kind of seeming conflicts there between different truth claims of Jain systems and scientific findings or scientific enterprises, scientific models. And in the last probably more than just 10, 15 years, we've seen a lot of activity like and I'm sure that there's been a lot by the International School of Jain Studies itself. Also, we have seen conferences on Jainism and science become extremely popular. So some of you might have been involved in that much more than me even, but so all of that is really an attempt to deal with that seeming incongruity and to resolve it. And I just have one more example, I think, and actually I apparently couldn't resist including something from my own research after all. Pragyaji, we're still moving correctly through the slides and everything, and you hear me well, right?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you for confirming. So from my own research then, and in some ways it seems like a very different type of example, a different case, but I think ultimately I can use it to make my argument about that composite nature of our human mind. So what I've been studying is on the right here, these Digambar Bhattarakas, these clotted renunciants. We still have them in Karnataka, but we had them all over Western India in the Sultanate and Mughal period up to the 20th century. They're clotted, they're largely sedentary, they manage properties. So they're definitely not the ideal naked, itinerant Digambara Muni who is possessionless. Yet, when I then started looking at my sources so many years back, and this is an argument that remains important enough for me to repeat it. Oh, here's in this manuscript a Bhattaraka Puja. And what does it actually say? Well, it calls him a Muni, and it refers to him as taking the five Mahavratas, and it describes and praises his virtues, his learning, his renunciation. Um, so I found myself somewhat there, faced with that conundrum of, okay, this is not an ideal Digambar Muni, but he's being idealized as an ideal Digambar announcer at the same time. Similarly, perhaps, and there this is so to speak very tentative, perhaps the Munis that we have nowadays again, and who by roop, by form, are ideal. They're naked, they're possessionless, they're itinerant. They, let's say, they observe their rules of conduct. They are learned, they're virtuous. But maybe some of them is something that I thought before. Maybe some of them also seem to have perhaps a bit of a temper, or perhaps they actually do have their limitations, and might be so, might not be so. But let's say that hypothetically, that could very well be the case. But at the same time, we are venerating these munis as representations, as embodiments, as this of these all these ideals. Is we literally project them, and then again we can think about the importance of anumodana, of praising the praiseworthy, etc. So actually, when we think about munis who perhaps are not so, in every sense of the word, ideal in terms of enlightened minds or freed from passions, or when we think about the more definite example of Bhattarakas being praised as ideal renouncers, there seems to be a bit of a similar paradox again, perhaps, which then I would answer through, well, I suppose my main answer there would be, well, Anumodana is a crucial, Anumodana, so being sympathetic or praising the praiseworthy, and through that partaking in the benefits to a second degree, not by doing something virtuous ourselves, nor by telling someone else to do it, karana, but third degree by praising what is praiseworthy, we actually get some karmic benefits ourselves also. But the paradox seems to be, let's focus on the example of the Bhattarakas in, say, 17th century Western India, that theoretically we know that this is not an ideal Digambar Muni. He should be naked and itinerant. But we're performing our puja, so for which I have historical evidence that people actually, that whole community supported these Bhattarakas as ideal renouncers. We're practicing Anumodana, and we're actually getting benefits. So the seeming incongruity here, which does not remain unanswered, but it is a heterogeneity at least. On the one hand, we know he's not ideal, and on the other hand, we do practice this form of idealization because perhaps it gives us advantages. So these also are two different thought worlds, two different perspectives on the same Bhattaraka. One where we know theoretically is not ideal, and another one where we actually take it for granted, or we imagine or we presume that he is the ideal because that is an important aspect of our practice itself. So again, we're shifting between two different perspectives here. And I mean, I say again, we're shifting between two different models, but with the ideal of the example of the cosmology, perhaps that's a point I didn't make sufficiently. But what I think is that Jains there also shift between models in the sense of, to take two extreme cases, perhaps when we do a certain Jain puja or a certain Jain practice in the temple, which involves traditional Jain cosmology, we're very much thinking about the world in terms of the hells, the heavens, Jambudvip, all of these elements. But then when the same Jain walks home or on a pilgrimage, needs to go to a different temple, maybe they will be using Google Maps or Google Earth or whatever it is. And so really ascribing to that scientific model of the world. So there also we actually see, and similar with medicine that I shortly referred to, or other sciences, physics, that there also Jains seem to be shifting between different models, traditional Jain ones, let's say, and modern scientific ones. So that shifting by itself, that's really what I'm focusing on. And what I in the rest of the presentation, which henceforth I'm afraid will be without images mostly. In the rest of the presentation, I mostly argue that that type of a shifting, and I listed the examples I went through here, but I'm sure they could be multiplied. I think at some point I had more examples to think of, but let's keep it to these four examples from different fields, different aspects of seeming paradoxes. My argument or my own answer, so to speak, to the riddle is that, well, maybe that is a very common human faculty, a skill to be shifting between different worldviews, between different models of ourselves. So rather than a problem here, the paradox actually becomes, well, a skill, a value, a capacity we have, and a capacity in a neutral sense, or rather we could put it also as something very positive rather than as something problematic. So here it becomes clear that I'm not trying to resolve the paradoxes in the sense of saying which is right, which is wrong, nor am I trying to, and I had another slide, it'll come up later, I think, nor am I trying to make the two compatible or somehow. Rather, I'm taking it for granted that that diversity within our mind and that shifting from one model to the other is always there. Now, these paradoxes, and I'm constantly putting them in quotation marks here just to show that I'm problematizing paradoxes in the technical sense of the word, that like I came to these examples through teaching, like I said, mostly, and I'm problematizing them in the sense of that I take them as my study, as the object of my study, but I don't regard them as a problem that needs resolving. Rather, I see it as I derive an insight into the structure of our mind, perhaps there. Now, these paradoxes, some of the examples I mentioned, are differences between individuals. The presence of the jina, like they can be one individual, a Jain, versus another. You can also have a certain diversity within what I call here temple communities, and I refer to that because that's something that I noticed in field work many years back, that when I talk to, and the cases I'm thinking of is like I'm talking to a pandit in a temple, and his interpretation of the Jina Murti, what it is and what it is not, could be very different than another devotee. So people within one community, one jati or one local community, people who do practice in the same temple on a regular basis, amongst them there could be heterogeneity. So it's not the individual which shifts from one template to the other, from one worldview to the other, but that exists on a second level. Within a certain limited community, you see that people could hold different ideas about the world, the self, the Jina, and then within social systems, within Jainism as a whole, because here I've been talking about doctrinal stances which typically would be shared across Jain traditions, religions, cultural systems, social organizations. Perhaps we could also think about how nations would like to um, hold forward this idea that there is a certain homogeneity, if not, I mean, that famous Indian stance, unity and diversity. Nationalism itself would also like to present a certain narrative, a certain rhetoric that unifies people, because that's what makes nationalism strong, that gives power to the nation. So in that sense, you see that social systems more broadly also, and we as individuals, as I wrote in the abstract, did I write like that's the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, whether on the individual or the national or the religious level. We present ourselves, we like, apparently it gives us, whatever it may be, it gives us a sense of safety or certainty or unity amongst each other, collectivity, to think of ourselves as, and I guess here I can start to use those slides, to think of ourselves as unitary, as homogeneous, as systematic, as logical, as well organized, as rational. Whereas in my cases here, I'm finding that we have paradoxes, contradictions, inconsistencies, incongruities. So, I mean, my color code, I don't know, putting them in red here is just meant to indicate perhaps that we might very well think of these things as problems. And that's, as I've been explaining, not the way I look at it. But the interesting thing is when we think about or when we use terms like paradoxes to incongruities, what is the system behind it that makes these seem perhaps problematical? In other words, what is the expectation? The expectation is for a singular, systematic, logically coherent, consistent, uniform system to be there. That is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, um, to the way we take ourselves to be and the way we present ourselves to be. So from that framework, from that expectation of singularity, of, if you want to call it that, theological consistency also perhaps, from that perspective, these seeming paradoxes become a problem and they might need resolution. What I present instead, or how I take it to be in these more neutral terms, is that heterogeneous nature and this messiness, which somehow I think has become a bit of a fashionable term in the humanities. I think I've seen it being used, and I haven't checked the whole background, but I think, you know, you have these Google Analytics kind of things where you can see how words, how frequently they're used. I suppose with messiness, you would see that in the last few years, that became a very popular term, and I subscribe to it because that's my finding also from these cases, that there seems to be a multiplicity, a heterogeneity, and a certain messy aspect. We're shifting from one template to the other. At the same time, that term messiness actually, well, it tells us something about the state of the field, so to speak. Although, as I said at the beginning, the field is perhaps broader than I'm aware of. But it tells us something about the state of the field in the sense that calling it messy is like, well, a messy term by itself. It's not a definite statement about the structure of the mind. It's just a finding, well, it seems to be messy. It seems to be more complex than what we know. But there's no definite conclusion about the structure of things, or perhaps there is no, maybe chaos is everything we have. And accepting that perhaps would also be a useful stance then. So heterogeneity against the expectation of homogeneity and order, and well-structured, well-ordered systems, rationality, a singular rationality behind all of our thinking and all of our actions. That's somehow the background that we may very often entertain about ourselves, Jane or non-Jane. So by this point of the presentation, I really, so to speak, leave the Jane cases, the Jane starting points of investigation behind, and my arguments are really about what I called the human mind in general. So in that sense, it's not Jane studies in the sense where I continue to talk about Jainism, but I really try to derive some insights into our human existence through studying practices and ideas of the Jain traditions. So I kind of already, so I have a few more slides with some further attempts of analysis of how all of this works, this shifting between cognitive templates, etc. And probably some of the aspects I already, in talking, ran ahead of myself a little bit. For example, what you've heard me talking about is that there's different ways to solve those paradoxes. We can argue that the one is right and the other is wrong. And probably in most of my cases, my four examples there, people will have forwarded arguments in favor of either side very much, or what we've also seen, attempts at reconciliation. So quite a lot of, in some cases, quite a lot of energy really being invested into trying to resolve the riddles. What I'm instead here doing is that, well, perhaps we just have to accept that that heterogeneity seems to be there and forget about our self-narratives about ourselves as being singular, as expressing or following singular rationalities always. So there I see that I called it here epistemic layering or shifting between different codes as an aspect of our cognition, widespread, not just among Jains, but about humans more generally, and actually perhaps even a skill, something that is useful in our existence, in our continued life as a core faculty. What else about that? Well, here in a way, I find myself coming back to, and I started by referring to how I started to think about these aspects in my teaching. The colored pieces here are basically like the structure of the core part of my introduction to Jainism as I teach it, meaning looking at different practices of Jains as a way to introduce the tradition beyond doctrine and philosophy. And in a way, this really represents or follows a longer standing shift in the study of Jainism in, let's say, Western academia at least, or in the study of religion more broadly, in the sense that a few decades ago, an introduction to Jainism or to any other religion would often have started with an overview of Jain doctrines, of Jain philosophical, rational, intellectual contents, the whole system. And again, there, no doubt, as a very well structured, unified system. And those courses or those books perhaps would then have ended with some final chapters on devotional practices or ritual practices or on Jain temple architecture. So what I do here, and by no means do I claim that as my own innovation, but it's just very indicative of changes within the field of Jain studies, religious studies, the humanities more broadly, that we're much more attuned to the actual ways in which people learn about their tradition, not by sitting in a classroom studying doctrines, but as a kid being taken to the temple by practicing fasting on holidays, by listening to stories. This is the way we actually imbibe these different cognitive templates, as I call them here. So when we think about the different cognitive templates and shifting behind them, what I'm doing here is trying to see how we actually come to adopt certain models of the world, of self, of the Jinnah perhaps also. So through all of these embodied multisensorial practices is what I, and not just me, argue how we come to it. The first two lines that I have here might actually be, well, more important. You could say perhaps that the color-coded aspects, perhaps these are ways in which Jains become Jain, how they learn about their tradition through listening through stories, through practicing devotion, through visiting certain specifically designed environment, built environments. But the dialogue and the social settings also very much there. But here I think I was more already thinking about, what shall we call it, inter-religious, also intercultural and interpersonal conversation, which actually introduces us to entirely different templates, different worldviews. And if I run ahead of myself here, I was thinking how I'm not really saying something extremely original here, but somehow I'm also marveling at how, in the past decades, century, century and a half, since Western scholarship firstly started to understand, find out about Indic traditions more general, let's say Sansar, Punarjanam, Karma, all these ideas have by now, what's the word, percolated, infiltrated so much Western thinking that I mean, we're all very much aware of what globalization is, but what globalization actually is, I think, is people in one part of the world becoming somewhat familiar, maybe only even on a theoretical level. We don't necessarily need to adopt those beliefs, but somehow they become a cognitive option. Like, say, I'm here in the US, people who are Christian or who consider themselves secular or who have any other religious identity, just by hearing about Jain and other Indian traditions which have different models, namely the one of karma and rebirth, it becomes a cognitive option. And in that sense, our worldview has already changed. We don't necessarily ascribe to those ideas of karma and rebirth, but just by intellectually knowing that that is also a possible way of looking at the world, we somehow have already imbibed that register, that worldview, that template also. So the aspect of believing, of making the decision, this is right, this is true, this is false, or not, is not even what interests me most or what I think is most important. But firstly, the idea that we can know different templates. And that kind of like helps to explain, I suppose, my point about switching between them in our daily lives, because they're somehow latently there. And perhaps it is often so that depending on the situation, depending on the context, we shift from one to the other. And there I can refer to my example of a Jain in a temple thinking about Jambudvip and the Jain cosmology, and in other cases using scientific technology and scientific cosmological models of the world, because that is more opportune at that moment. So there you see that different registers can be like activated, highlighted at certain moments, depending on the need, depending on the context, on what is most useful, perhaps also. So I skipped something here. I talked about methods of adoption, so that was about forms of practice, I guess, mostly. But here I tried to list another type of analysis of what I called here modes of adoption. And mostly, really, I started with the first one here, that humoristic aspect, and that's why I moved forward to that idea of karma and rebirth. Humoristic, I think what I tried here is like, I'm sure it's not necessarily correct or it can be varied or there's different steps, but more or less I tried to order these modes as like a way that people or that I found myself to often um, adopt, get familiarized with new models of the world and self, and in which that humoristic element apparently often comes very first. And what I'm thinking of is those ideas of karma and rebirth. I mean, I referred back to Indological 19th, 18th century scholarship and how that percolated, and how now ideas of karma in pop culture, in songs, in like street talk on the corner, you would hear people referring to, oh, this they describe what happened to them this and that day, and oh, it's just karma happening me, this and that. People don't necessarily believe in that, and I really very much problematize the word of belief, but in that sense, that might not be their primary worldview. That might not be their religious identity to think about the world in terms of karma and rebirth, but they jokingly use it. And so I said I call this like a first step, because it's like an attempt at exploration. Whether we believe it or not is not so important, but maybe at a later level we actually do start to make sense of what happens to us, of our daily human activities or experiences in certain ways. So in that sense, a poetical register can perhaps be a certain level where you have really this metaphorical understanding. Um, in green, then perhaps at some point we might or we might not actually come to the point where we really analyze what happens to us in our experience in such terms as karma, for example. At some point, maybe we have those multiple registers, as I referred to them before, different interpretative options, which we may shift on dependent on concept. And ultimately, we may also identify with one single model strongly. And so that's what then becomes a religious identity, or a non-religious, maybe a scientific identity would be exactly the same, where you say, this is my truth, this is how I see the world, this is my belief, this is my, in the religious sphere, it could be my sectarian identity. And there, it's a choice that I'm in none of what I'm talking about here, I'm making any judgment or on what is right and wrong practice or decision making with regards to these multiple identities, multiple templates. But this last step here, this is the one where we, what I called before, we tell ourselves a story about ourselves, about that singularity, about that singular rationality that we supposedly are. Whereas my findings from my study of Jainism show that we actually shift between templates. So that's actually the point where rhetorically, narratively, we try to tell ourselves that no, there is no such diversity. We actually do follow a singular um, rationality. So that's like a sectarian stance, so to speak. So in that sense, from a humoristic reference to something to actually seeing it as one of the different options to interpret our experiences and to make sense of our experiences, to see that causation, to identifying very strongly with a singular model, kind of a progression, so to speak, of becoming familiar with certain worldviews, certain cognitive templates. So in which I think then I use this as an example to show that really massive world change that we've been experiencing in the last 50 years, perhaps of where where these Indic IDs have really become globalized, world spread and so what is actually happening is that that worldview, that cognitive template has become an option for people all across the world. And again, whether people actually ascribe to it or not, it became an option. And the example that I was thinking of really, I practiced forms of meditation relatively intensively for a while. So these could also like, I mean, that would be definitely a sense through which I entered this worldview, this world of this view of self. But what I also found is that in theoretically studying Indian religion since a decade and a half, whatever, I remember many years back that somehow I found, and again, it's not about believing, about ascribing to, but at some point I realized, well, I've been studying Jainism, Buddhism, Hinduism, they all have these ideas of karma and rebirth, and somehow just through that intellectual study, that register was installed in my mind, that template, and that I, perhaps jokingly, perhaps poetically, metaphorically, also started to experience, to analyze my experiences in such a way. I think I just have a few last things. Um, well, one parallel, I call it here, for um, these findings, these observations, these arguments about the composite, heterogeneous, and ultimately perhaps messy nature of our human minds is social roles. We play different social roles. We have different social identities. When I'm with my family, when I'm with friends, when I'm with colleagues, I become a different persona, so to speak. That's not necessarily a different worldview in cases like cosmology, etc., but perhaps that somehow plays on a certain level that we also follow, well, a different code of conduct, but perhaps also a different cognitive template. We really, I mean, so I'm forwarding this now as an example of to show how we actually behave and think and act and interact in different ways depending on different social contexts. So knowing that much, that more familiar aspect of our existence, perhaps that's a good parallel to understand the degree to which we actually also really shift between these different worldviews. What it also relates to is, well, the interplay of rationality and emotions and affect. That rationality is not something that is completely detached from our emotions. And what I'm thinking of here is when we're in a happy mood, in an enlightened mood, um, we might see the world in a certain way, in a very positive way. We might interpret everything as an opportunity, as a possibility. We see the beauty in the world, so to speak. Whereas when we are afraid or when we are experiencing physical pain, our whole experience and our whole interpretation of the world also becomes different. So the related aspect here then is that our emotional state really also determines our perception of the world and our cognition and our interpretation of our surroundings. So in that sense, our state of mind and the world, and here I'm thinking of mentioned before that there's a lot of scholarship, cognitive studies, philosophy that I could and clearly should be relating to if I want to continue thinking about these things. And there's Embodied Minds is a book, is it from the late 80s even or 90s, where which already then and by now in these decades, I'm sure the field progressed a lot, but which already then made the argument that neither are we as individuals preformed, nor is the world preformed in a certain way, but both ourself and the world somehow are created in the interaction between the two. So that's probably uh, not clear enough as an explanation, but so the line of thought that I was opening up for myself in the first place, perhaps here is that that relation between embodiment, emotionality, and that sheerly rational intellectual templates and the diversity there, there's also some kind of a link there between effect and ratio. I have a few, are these my last? Yep, these are just my last points here, and it's perhaps also a messy list of little things which I did want to mention. That in my arguments for the composite and messy nature of our human minds, the background to that is perhaps my disbelief in the concept of belief. So to speak, I don't believe in belief, or I think that we should problematize the aspect of belief because, and this is something that I speak often enough about with my students and whoever wants to listen, but it really is an important element of my worldview, which ultimately um, opens me, so to speak, to the kind of observations that I've been talking about here, is what is actually belief? I mean, we don't have a certain organ that takes care of belief. We strongly believe in belief when we talk about, oh, James believe that, or I believe that, but where does that actually happen in our minds and in our bodies? In something is there, a world, I've been calling it a worldview and a cognitive template. Ultimately, perhaps that's the same. But I would say that because we don't know exactly how it functions, where it functions, and there my argument comes that, well, it functions through listening to stories and through going to temples. That's how we actually develop what we call beliefs. But very often in our descriptions of religions, in our descriptions of ourselves, we talk about beliefs without actually knowing how they came about, where they are located in our minds and bodies. So there, I guess that my argument of and it's related to doctrines where we actually often boil down religious systems to a set of doctrines and obviously there a unitary systematic system of theology that we think of that case not the individual but that religious system as unified as singular and as bearing none of the paradoxes that we actually seem to be finding when we look at when we discover them by looking at different aspects of those traditions. Um, my arguments also go against the idea of truth claims in the sense that when certain beliefs or certain religious identities or sectarian identities include a certain truth claim, what we are doing then, as I probably mentioned before, is we are ascribing to a singular model to the exclusion of all others. Um, so in a sense, and I guess there's probably a bit of a personal backstory there also, but my academic endeavor here of coming to terms with that composite and messy nature of our minds, if you um, if we are enticed to look at things in such a way, that goes against um, having a sectarian identity in the sense of not necessarily ascribing to a singular one. And social roles, I guess I repeat myself there. So these are really just the thoughts I had on the topic so far. Um, And I mean, in your kind introductions, there was all kinds of wonderful other things which could also be done. I'm sorry I wasn't able to do that, but I'll be happy to hear about those aspects. And then, as I said multiple times, I'm very much aware that there must be bodies of scholarship which have answered these questions or have struggled with them or have given perhaps other options or perhaps also have already forwarded very similar findings or similar argumentations. But so in that sense, the paper I put together here had a certain background coming from my findings of these paradoxes, thinking about them and offering this here as a ultimately as an analysis that that seems to be the the nature of our human minds that we shift between different models in different contexts in different situations and that perhaps that is really Jane's or non-Jane's the reality rather than um, um, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves as being or operating according to singular rationalities. And I think I've been using the same word referred to Google Analytics, like probably if you would perform that operation on my talk, you would notice that I repeated myself a lot by talking to heterogeneity and composite nature and messiness, etc. But I hope at least the ultimately very simple argument that I wanted to forward became clear a little bit. So, Pragaji, I don't know. I hope that must have been under 40 minutes, but
About. Thank you
I'll
so
hand it
much.
back to you.
Thank you so much for the talk and for sharing your first-hand experience of teaching and experiencing Jainism. I would request if there is any question or comment from the audience. Yes, Prakash ji.
Lecture, if I may say so, and a very broad in terms of canvas and the themes. Let me begin by saying, I mean, I will not go into the second part, the messy nature of, I mean, human mind or whatever you call our cognition or things like that. But I'll confine a few things about Jainism and maybe, I mean, say something which may or may not help you in, understanding a few things. To begin with, I would say that all religions are ideologies. They are partial truths, and they should be taken that way. I'm just, making very cryptic kind of remarks. Second point is that given your background of Digambar Jainism, these paradoxes may be more, when you generalize in terms of Jainism, rather than saying Digambar Jainism or Shwetambar Jainism, because here I am reminded of John Fort's work, where in certain sects of Shwetambar Jainism or Jains, he does not find the Moksha ideology at all. Instead of, he's talking, you must be knowing about it, the concept of well-being. So Moksha versus well-being, there's a real paradox, if I may say so, in Jainism. I mean, which manifests itself in, I think, all these paradoxes, if I may say so. I think, well, I am not sure. I think so. If you this, I mean, I've been trying to myself understand as a part-time student of Jainism as to what is this Shwetambar, Digambar, and even I mean, after reading Fort's work, I fully realized I have a Digambar Jain background from Central India. So this concept of well-being and the absence of Moksha ideology in Shwetambar Jainism and the same in Digambar Jainism, its presence, that even, highlights or intensifies these all kinds of contradictions, if I may say so. So I think one should look into the organizational aspect of both these, sects, if I may say so, and then maybe see something that another thing is that if I, I have been greatly influenced by Max Weber's half chapter in Religion of India, which is, I think, which about Jainism, he says, the soteriologies of professional monks. So actually, I believe that Jainism was meant for ascetics and not for, it was later on that people started following it. So basically, I mean, it is an absolute kind of religion. And when you have to follow it, then maybe all kinds of contradictions may come because you cannot adhere to the same ideals which you actually practice in day-to-day life. So I think with these straight remarks, if you can probably respond, then I'll also get enlightened about my thinking as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Mm.
Prakash.
Yeah.
I think Sledge, you want to say something.
I would love to. These are wonderful remarks. Thank you so much for sharing these. Um, the various points. You started by saying ultimately all religions are ideological, and you said secondly they're partial truths. So these are two different elements. But the fact about that all religions are partial truths, which is an Anikantvat perspective, that's actually something that I don't necessarily find myself too enticed to engage with, or that's not my inquiry here, because then we are back into the field of truth claims about finding out what is true and what is not true. And I don't want to take a stance on that. I don't want to determine which perspective is correct and not. I'm more interested in that finding that there seems to be this heterogeneity. The first point, however, when you said all religions are ideologies, this is something I don't necessarily need to refer back to my teaching experience constantly, but this is something that so strongly came up there. So even though what I've been talking about and what was on my last slide here are so basic elements of my thinking about what religion is and what it is not, even that being so fundamentally, I still find myself in class very often having to respond to students' questions by telling them that, oh, please remember that whenever I talk about Jainism as being so and so, or as Jains believing so and so, remember that we're at that moment, we're actually talking about exactly what you said about a certain ideology, about a moksha mark ideology, indeed, often. Whereas people's practices, people's actions are often much more pragmatic. This is the ideal, this is the ideology, this is the theory, this is in ethical fields, this is what we strive towards. But how strongly we actually manage to manifest, to act according to these very high ideals is a very different matter. So in terms of Jain diets or Jain ritual practices or non-violence, what I then often find me talking to my students about is, remember, when we're talking about Jainism, much of the time we're describing this ideology, but that ideology is something we strive towards. That's not a description of the reality of Jain communities and individuals throughout history. So in that sense, that first remark of you was extremely valuable already. The point referring to John's work about moksha mark ideologies and well-being as being two aspects of the daily lives of Jains, that there very much is space for well-being practices as well next to that high moksha mark ideology. It's probably something that I can think about and somehow integrate into my thinking here. Like, yeah, I mean, if it ever was a paradox, then John settled it, so to speak, by saying, well, they're both there, I suppose. But so that's perhaps the first way that I would integrate it. But it's a great case. It's a very structural, very fundamental example also of that seeming diversity. So that's definitely something I'm sure that with a fresh mind, I find more usages to put that work and that argument into my thinking here. And then your last point was about the possible contradictions or the differences between ascetic and layperson practices. And there, indeed, I would say that, well, the monks' actual practices mimic the high ideals or strive towards them at a more intense level. The Mahavratas versus the Anuvratas, for example, that difference, that different application, that more strict following or attempting to follow certain rules, as another case of diversity. Yeah, that's also something that I can see how I integrate it into my thinking, but these were all three absolutely very relevant statements or
Thank you.
feedback.
you.
Thank you.
Dr. Tillo, can you please stop sharing your screen?
Yep. I thought maybe people might sometimes in other types of lectures, sometimes it might be useful to still have the
People like,
slides to them, but I don't think it will be necessary.
all right. I think like G wants to say something.
I just want to, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I want to say thank you. We have a great scholar in Tillo at, uh, at that university, and we are very proud to have you, Tillo. You and I have spoken before, but the whole Jain community in the eastern corridor of USA, you are the only one so far, and you are carrying the torch, so we are grateful. And I think
Yeah.
and the interaction between your students and also with the Samnijis and with Jain community is because that gives experience. I know you have been to JVB in New Jersey. Samniji, we have been to your class. I think you are closing that gap. The only thing I want to say is somewhere I read many years ago, in each man there are many different kinds of men reside in each man. So I think we behave differently, just like you said. We look at the Jambu Dweep, and then we use Google. Huh? Okay, all of us are made of those kind of things. So thank you for your talk.
Well, thank you. Yeah,
Thank
I mean, sounds like a beautiful, what's the word? An epigraph, perhaps, if it comes from some famous literary source, perhaps what you just recited there. But so indeed, I think in
Yeah.
one way, the argument, my argument, if I have to call it an argument, is something that we might know very well that diversity, but at other points of our life, we try to reduce that heterogeneity because it's makes things more straightforward to think that we always operate according to a single model. So it's kind of interesting how on the one level, what I'm talking about is so obvious and so well known, but at the same time, at other moments, we really explain it away or reduce it away, so to speak. Yeah. Thank you.
Actually, we are running out of time. Can we quickly take your question, Jinesh? And then
Yeah, sure. I had two of them, but I'll uh, make it one. So, thank you for this very insightful talk. Thank you so much. Uh, I don't know if I've missed this in the first few minutes of the presentation, but were there any comments on Anekantavada along this, what you presented today?
Oh,
And could you make some?
yeah. Mhm.
Thank you.
Dinesh, hi. Nice to see you here. There were not. I don't know if the abstract, like some longer outline of where I had started to organize my thoughts. I actually did have a little paragraph about it, and somehow in the process I forgot about them. But I mean, I wouldn't be able to engage in it at your level of analysis because I'm not a specialist of Jain philosophy, let alone Anikantvad. But there. I'd need to check my thoughts as I'd written them out, but more or less what I felt and why indeed I should have added it, and thanks to you, I can still do so now. The reason why I should add it is because that obviously is a way that Jains have always dealt with diversity. So obviously, so indeed, I should look at it. But my feeling about it, why ultimately it wasn't, so to speak, satisfactory to me, is, well, I mean, Anekantvad, Nayavad, descriptions of different perspectives. Ultimately, though, the perspective of the liberated Jina transcends all these partial, limited perspectives. So there still is like, and again, I'm not disagreeing, I'm not taking a stance on whether that is true or not true, but ultimately in Anekantvad, there is the idea that there is a singular perspective possible of the liberated Jina. So that ultimately, on a certain theoretical level, for me, feels like explaining away the diversity, like the different nayas, the different perspectives. Oh, well, they're all partially true, partially correct, but they are all partial, and there is one transcendent perspective of a liberated being, which includes all of these partial truths. Whereas what I talk about and the reality that I just accept is, well, perhaps I'm talking about our samsaric state of mind, so to speak, within our limited, what's the word, mohaniya, our occluded vision. there is this diversity. That's what happens between this life and this death, so to speak. So I'm really trying to analyze, trying to describe that reality of what we do in our daily lives, perhaps from moment to moment. And I see ourselves as switching between different codes, different registers, different cognitive templates. So in that sense, I'm really like analyzing the cognitive activities which I have access to. And in that sense, that ultimate perspective that transcends the different nayas, that's a philosophical enterprise. That's a crucial part of Jainism. That's interesting in its own right, but somehow it's a state I cannot access. It's a perspective I cannot access right now. So I somehow content myself to study that diversity and that code switching and that heterogeneity in the here and now in our daily lives. And I find that more than interesting enough because ultimately, one of the things I came up to is like that perspective it offers on sectarian identities or on telling ourselves that we are following a singular rationality. Ultimately, my focus on that heterogeneity helps me or could help us, if that's what purpose we want to put it to, helps us to stay away from sectarian identification and from exclusionary things. So in that sense, maybe my analysis is Vadik in the sense that it helps us to transcend partial truths. No. But the first thing I said is that it's not useful for me um, because I'm taking for granted or I'm just seeing the reality of that code switching and I want to study what is happening there actually. But what I said even before that is that your point about, well, Jane seemed to have that thing called Anigvant and you didn't talk about it in your lecture. You're very right about that. I definitely should always, at least what I did right now, like at least relate to it and see to which degree I agree or disagree or find it interesting for my study or not. So thank you very much, Tina.
Thank
Great
you,
question.
Tillo.
Thank you.
Nitin Shah, Mr. Shah is raising his hand. All
I'll
right.
make it quick, Pragya ji. I know we
Yes,
are running
yes.
out. Actually, Jinesh asked my question. I wanted to bring out the whole perspective of Anikantvad, and there are reasons why Jains do some of the things of temples, rituals, this, that, and other. So I'm not going to elaborate and go into it because that point is already discussed. Thank you. Thank you
Great,
for
great, great.
considering, Dr. Tiloji, that there are different perspectives that we need to learn about. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Now I will move
Detige,
to
I
our,
gladly yield you my time.
yes, Chairperson, Mr. Manish, Dr. Manish Mehta.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. First of all, Jai Jinendra, everybody. And I'm honored to deliver these chairperson remarks this morning or evening. First of all, my heartfelt thanks to ISJS and each of you esteemed scholars and distinguished guests who have taken the time and joined us in this presentation by Professor Tillo Detige. And also for the ensuing discussions we had. So I think that helped provide more clarity to this. I made some prepared remarks and also appreciate a lot of insights and inputs from Professor Dr. Srinetra Pandey in delivering these. So I'm going to read through these in the interest of time because I can otherwise ramble on. Well, what an insightful and thought-provoking discussion we have just witnessed. The presentation has challenged us to reconsider the nature of epistemic consistency, urging us to embrace the plurality of perspectives that shape our understanding, both individually and collectively. And after all, as Tillo alluded in the last part of his talk, that human mind and we ourselves are subject to our own weaknesses and assertions, then sometimes dichotomies, therefore, in our existence that we have to all deal with. But yet we are blessed with the power of the intellect, to be able to even recognize that we have these dichotomies. So amongst the four stimulating ideas he presented on the paradoxes, we were introduced to at least a couple of compelling examples. One was the incongruity between scientific cosmology and traditional Jain cosmology. as well as second, the paradoxical devotional presence of the liberated jina, and then the other paradoxes around the absence of the jina and the presence of the jina that he presented in his first example. And the other one was the differences between Jain yoga, tantric practices, and how we tend to use allopathic medicine for our short-term cures and issues versus working on the systemic aspects and the karmic aspects, which is what Jain yoga emphasizes. So these instances highlight the complexities inherent in reconciling traditional belief systems with evolving knowledge frameworks. Rather than forcing a resolution through either strict rationalism or absolute faith, we have been invited to recognize the fluidity with which our minds navigate different epistemic models. Jain doctrine of Anekantvad, the principle of multiple viewpoints or non-absolutism, offers profound wisdom in this regard. Instead of perceiving contradictions as obstacles, we might see them as reflections of the diverse and composite nature of human cognition. The talk has reminded us that striving for absolute consistency can sometimes limit rather than enhance our understanding. With this perspective, it is important to recognize how our personal and collective identities take shape. The narratives we construct about ourselves and the world around us often seek coherence, but this coherence can sometimes obscure the richness of our multifaceted experiences. If we instead welcome the multiplicity within our own thinking and traditions and be more open to that, we allow ourselves to therefore engage with new possibilities that transcend rigid classifications and intellectual boundaries. This discussion encourages us to not only reconsider how we view Jainism, but also how we approach knowledge and belief across different domains. Whether in religion, philosophy, or scientific inquiry, the ability to switch between epistemic frameworks without feeling constrained by a singular truth is an intellectual strength rather than a weakness. As we leave this conversation, let us take with us the humility to accept complexity, the curiosity to explore new perspectives, and the openness to rethink our own certainties, or that so-called messiness that was alluded to in this talk. So as we depart from this discussion, let us also carry forward this openness to diverse perspectives, allowing ourselves to engage more freely with the complexities of thought, belief, and interpretation. I appeal to all of you to continue reflecting on these ideas and to bring them into your own intellectual pursuits as you go forward. I also want to share with you some words of wisdom that we use. I'm a Rotarian for about 30 years, and there is something I use that is real simple. We call it the Rotary International's four-way test of how we, of all the things that we think, say, and do. And I think it reflects very closely here. And I'll repeat it. There's just four cardinal rules we try to follow. And I'll suggest them here and, humbly place them in front of you to also consider when you look at life's dilemmas and situations. So the first rule is, first, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? And fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? So when you look at just everything that you encounter, every human relationship, whether it is or dilemmas or problems, and the world has many problems lately. If you look at just applying this four cardinal rule filter, I think you'll get some unique insights into multiplicity and anekantvad from there, and perhaps a path to follow with actionable outcomes. Once again, I extend my deepest gratitude to Tillo, our distinguished speaker, for this brilliant exposition, and to all of you for your engagement and queries and perspectives that you lent to this discussion. May these reflections continue to inspire meaningful dialogue in the times to come. With that, I'd like to wish you all the best, and thank you. Over to you again, Pragyaji. Thank you again for your facilitation and to Dr. Pandey for his help with working through this.
Thank you, Dr. Mehta. Now I would request Dr. Ashok Singh to present the vote of thanks.
Jai Jinendra, everybody. This is my pious duty as well as privilege to present vote of thanks on the occasion of 22nd lecture of our monthly series. I am very thankful to Dr. Tillo Detige for his enlightening speech in which he covered a wide range of Jainism. He highlighted the contradictions between theories and practice, which are due to the evolution or passage of time. Dr. Mehta has very beautifully underlined the main features of the lectures of Dr. Tillo. So ISJS is very thankful to Dr. Tillo and our chairperson, Dr. Mehta, for sparing their valuable time to make our program success. I also express my sense of gratitude to our patron, Dr. Sulek Jain, Dr. Nitin Shah, Narendra Parson, Dr. Prakash Chand Jain, Johnny Cart, Ashok Jethawat, and Reverend somebody Sasi Pragya ji and Samut Pragya ji, Anil Mudra ji, Akhilesh Jain, Dr. Natalia, Dr. Abha Jain, and a host of young scholars who are actively associated with the activities of ISJS, like Joanna, Erika, Jinesh Shah, Dr. Sailesh Sinde, and Ifan, who is our regular participant, and Dr. Ruth. And I also am very thankful to our director for engaging two great scholars who made this program very successful, and our colleagues Pragya Jain, Harshit Misra, and Gopal Kundle for making this program very successful. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Ashok Singh. And keep watching this space. Thank you everyone for coming. We will announce the next lecture soon. Thank you, Jai Jinendra. Has
Already announced. The next lecture will be delivered on June 12 by Professor Kanti Maradia. And the topic is Taming the Inner Enemies, Jain Wisdom on Destructive Emotions in Modern World by Professor Kanti Maradia on June 12, next month. Thank you so much.